Hey everyone, welcome back to the dark side. I'm your host Sherry. Today we're talking about some crimes that took place in the 80s and 90s in the Indiana and Ohio area with an unlikely suspect. My sources are in the description area. This is episode 131, the case of Herb Baumeister. Before we dive in today, I gotta put this out there. This episode was actually ready to go over a month ago. I had spent countless hours researching, writing, and editing, but just one day before it was set to release, I saw that another true crime podcast had covered the exact same case, and they published their episode a day before mine was scheduled to go live. If this were an unsolved case, I wouldn't have hesitated to release it anyway, but since it's a solved case, I didn't want to feel like I was repeating content that had just been covered by a very popular show, so I shelved it. For the past month, I've been sitting on it, unsure of what to do with it. After thinking it over, I decided it's been long enough, I guess. I don't really know if there's a specific etiquette around how long you should wait in situations like this. But in the end, what matters most are the victims, not podcast timing. So here we go. In 1994, a man named Tony Harris was at a gay bar called the 501 Club in Indianapolis, Indiana. There's a missing poster on the wall of his friend Roger. Tony sees a man standing there looking at this missing poster pretty intently. Tony approaches him and says, "That's my good friend Roger. He went missing recently." The two men begin chatting, and the other man introduces himself as Brian Smart. Brian asks Tony, "Do you want to ditch this bar and come back to my house?" Tony agrees, and they get in Brian's Buick and leave the bar and drive for about 35 minutes. They arrive at Brian's house, and this wasn't the apartment or condo Tony was expecting. This is a full-on mansion in the middle of nowhere. He enters through the main part of the house, but is quickly shuffled into the pool room. So there's this gigantic indoor pool room with a fully stocked bar, and it's just this awesome place. But Tony is feeling a little nervous because he's gone back with men to their homes before, but none like this. Brian had told Tony he was a landscaper. How does he own this huge mansion? When he asks Brian about it, "How did you get this huge house?" He says he doesn't own it. He's just the landscaper, and the family is away on vacation. But what really freaks him out is there are mannequins all over this pool room. They're dressed in swimming clothes and have cups in their hands. It looks like some of them are engaging in conversation with each other. Tony is like, WTF? Brian says sometimes he gets lonely, so he has all these mannequins having a pool party around him, so he has people to talk to. Tony is thinking this may be some weird rich people thing. Brian offers Tony a drink, but he declines. Super smart move on his part. Brian dips out for a moment and comes back, and he's super talkative. Tony believes Brian did a few rails of cocaine. They get into the pool together, and Brian asks Tony if he's ever been choked during sex. Brian goes on to tell him all the wonderful things about doing that. Tony is much bigger than Brian. He hasn't been drinking. He knows he could overpower this guy if things go wrong. Tony gives consent, and Brian wraps a pool hose around his neck. Tony begins to realize that Brian isn't going to stop choking him, so he pretends to pass out. Brian removes the pool hose from Tony's neck, and Tony begins coming to. Pretending like he was unconscious for a moment, Tony's like, "Yeah, I think it's time for me to go." Brian later drives Tony back to Indianapolis and drops him off. Tony is convinced that his friend Roger left the bar with Brian and that Brian killed him. Tony is putting all these pieces together in his mind. The weird mannequins, the choking, it all makes sense. Tony and Brian decide to meet up again in a week. Tony is going along with it because he wants to get to the bottom of where Roger could be. It's important to mention that Tony Harris is not his real name. It's the name used in media reports to keep his identity from being put out there. Tony goes to a man named Virgil Vandegrift. He is a former Marion County sheriff, but now he's a private investigator. He had been hired by Roger's mother to help find her son. In fact, he was hired by another mom to help locate her son, Alan. Both men are between the ages of 28 and 32. Both are gay and were heading out to a gay bar in Indianapolis the night they disappeared. He knows there has to be a connection. The reason why both of these moms went to a private detective is because there is, get ready for this, a 30-day waiting period to report a person missing. I've heard of 24 hours. I've heard of 48 hours. I've never heard of 30 days. I had to look this up, and in Indianapolis today in 2024, there's no waiting period. You can report someone missing right away. But back then, you had to wait 30 days before police are going to start looking. This private detective says that that's the reason why families come to him. He's in the private sector, so he can do things like the police can, and he's not affiliated with them. He doesn't have to wait 30 days. He can get started right away. Detective Vandegrift was contacted by a publisher for a gay magazine, and he says those aren't the only two men missing. He says there's lots more gay men in the area who have gone to a bar and disappeared, but their families are brushed off by police. The Indianapolis police were treating them like low priorities, according to the families. According to reporting by Joe Geringer, many in the community thought these missing men had set out to San Francisco or New York, where their lifestyle was more accepted. I'm disgusted that these folks were reported missing, but brushed off by police just because they were gay. This private detective is basically working on his own. He's putting up missing person flyers in a lot of gay bars and clubs. He's handing them out to people walking down the street. According to reporting by Charles Montaldo, Detective Vandegrift is convinced there is a serial killer targeting gay men in Indiana, especially when he learns that for the last few years, there's been an investigation going on in Ohio next door. Bodies were found strangled and dumped on the side of I-70. All were men and teenage boys. All were gay. 4 were from Indianapolis. This killer was dubbed the I-70 Strangler. Is it possible the I-70 Strangler has moved his operations to Indiana? When I heard I-70 in Ohio, I immediately thought of our episode 121, the case of David Carter. He was found dismembered along I-70 in Ohio. His girlfriend is still on the run. I swear, the stories I've heard about I-70 in Ohio will make you never want to drive there. Detective Vandegrift goes to Indianapolis State Police and tells them there is a serial killer in Indianapolis killing gay men, and he's possibly the I-70 Strangler. And they're kind of like, we'll look into it. It gets buried at the bottom of the stack. Tony goes to Detective Vandegrift and tells him about his experience with this man named Brian Smart. And he tells him about all the weird stuff he saw, being strangled and other things he picked up on in the short time he was there. Tony also says he took this information to the police and the FBI, but it didn't go anywhere. Detective Vandegrift wants to kind of set Tony up for another meeting with Brian Smart, one that he would monitor so that he can get more info about him. He was just going to follow them, but Brian Smart never showed up. Detective Vandegrift has a friend that is a detective named Mary Wilson. He asked her to take Tony out and drive through rich neighborhoods to see if Tony could recognize the house. Tony says none of these houses resembled the one he went to that night. He does remember at the entrance to the house, there was a sign that said something Farms. He can't remember anything else about the sign. Detective Vandegrift does find a Fox Hollow Farms, and he goes up to the house, but no one is home. He peers through the windows looking for mannequins and tries to smell around the side door to see if he could smell chlorine. That would indicate there is an indoor pool, just like Tony described. He gets aerial shots of the property and shows them to Tony. Tony says he believed the driveway was much longer. 1 year later, Tony is at a bar and sees Brian Smart. Tony makes sure to go outside and write down his license plate number. He gives it to Detective Mary Wilson, who runs the tag, and says his name is not Brian Smart. His name is Herb Baumeister. Let's get into who Herb Baumeister is. Herb is 48 years old. He lives in a house on Fox Hollow Farm. It's a huge estate and he has 18 acres. He married his wife Julie in 1971 and together they have 3 children. Herb grew up the oldest of 4 children. Herb's father was an anesthesiologist and provided a great life for his wife and children. Herb was different, though. He exhibited a lot of odd characteristics. He was diagnosed at a young age with paranoid schizophrenia and antisocial personality disorder. However, his family did not seek treatment, likely due to the stigma back then of mental illness. He didn't have a lot of friends, mostly because they felt he was strange. He would start a conversation saying things like, "I wonder if urine tastes good." He also played with dead animals and was fascinated by them. He got mad at his teacher, so he urinated on her desk. Another time, he left a dead bird on her desk. After high school, he attended Indiana State University, but dropped out in his first semester. He came back a year later after pressure from his father and later went to Butler University. His strangeness continued as an adult in the workforce. He's not just somebody's weird coworker. His coworkers said he did his job well, but they couldn't get past some things, such as getting upset with his boss and urinating on his desk. A woman named Marietta Braunstein worked with Herb's father in the surgery ward. She told Fox News that Herb's father was this kind, well-respected anesthesiologist, and he confided in her about his son, saying he was concerned about him. For example, she said he was really disappointed that his son had dropped out of college. Another instance he was really bothered about was Herb had purchased a used hearse that he would pick up women for dates in. Herb meets a woman named Julie, who is a high school teacher, and they are married in 1971. One thing that they both shared an interest in is that they were both ultra-conservative. They also wanted to own their own business one day. 6 months into their marriage, Herb's father has him committed into a mental institution. We don't know the reason why, but Herb spent 2 months there. Julie was waiting for him at home with open arms when he was released. Julie told People magazine in 1996, "He was nice, fun to be with, and good looking. We both liked cars and we were both Republicans." His dad knew some folks at the Indiana Star newspaper and got him a job making copies, but he eventually left for a job at the Indiana Department of Motor Vehicles. He didn't work well with others. He did amazing at his job and even got a good promotion, but coworkers didn't do well with him. He was bossy and aggressive. According to reporting by Charles Montaldo, he sent a funny Christmas card to each of his coworkers. The card was a photo of him and another man dressed in drag wearing holiday clothes. Back in the 70s, that kind of stuff wasn't as accepted as it would be today. His coworkers are all whispering that they think Herb is a closeted homosexual. I mean, they're not wrong. He really was gay, but he was using his marriage to Julie as a cover. In 1985, Herb was fired from the Department of Motor Vehicles after he urinated on a letter addressed to Indiana Governor Robert Orr. What is up with this guy's fascination with pissing on things? Herb was known to do some other weird stuff. For example, back in the 80s and 90s, if you wanted concert tickets, you had to go wait in line at the ticket outlet. Sometimes you would wait for hours. Herb would sometimes phone his neighbors in the middle of the night from a payphone and say he was waiting in line for tickets, but he has an emergency to deal with. Can you come take my spot? His neighbors are like, no, screw off. If it's that big of an emergency, just screw the tickets and do whatever you got to do. Herb would get super angry about this and begin yelling at them on the phone. In 1988, Herb had been staying home to care for his children while Julie worked as an English teacher, but he decided it was time to head back to the workforce. He began working at a thrift store and quickly learned the business. He saw this as an opportunity to make money. He wants to own his own store. He gets a loan from his mother and he opens a store called Save-A-Lot. This store would do really well and lead to other stores. Herb and Julie are now doing great financially, so well in fact that they were donating $50,000 every year to the Children's Bureau of Indianapolis. In 1991, they bought land near Indianapolis called Fox Hollow Farms. It had a beautiful large house, a gigantic indoor pool room. The house was wonderful to raise the three kids in. No one could believe that Herb Baumeister was now this successful, wealthy family man. Julie was able to quit her job as an English teacher now that Herb owned these successful stores, but their marriage wasn't great. According to ESSA News, Julie says that they were never intimate. Yeah, they had three kids, but sex was like a once every couple years thing. She said in total they've had sex 6 times during their entire marriage. Each time had to be in complete darkness. She wasn't allowed to see him naked. What Julie doesn't know is that Herb is really gay. He's leading a double life. He's sleeping with multiple men and picking them up at bars. He has no interest in having sex with her. He's not even attracted to her. Herb always called the shots in the marriage. He often speaks over Julie, and everything has to be his way all the time. To get away from this, Julie frequently took trips with her 3 kids. Herb's family had a lakeside condo 100 miles away, and Julie would go there with the kids and stay for days. This happened a lot. This also left Herb with lots of freedom, and that is when he was venturing out to the clubs and the bars. An owner of one of those clubs' name is Jim Brown. He owns the Metropolitan Restaurant and Nightclub. He says that when people enter a gay bar like his, they're either very nervous or very comfortable. He says Herb was always nervous when he walked through the doors. Julie remembers a time that her son was 13 years old and he comes running inside. He tells his mom that he found a human skull in the yard. Julie goes out there expecting that it's really going to be just an animal skull, but it's a for real human skull. When Herb arrives home, she tells him about it. He says it's one of his dad's old medical anatomy skeletons. He said that he found it in an old box and thought the proper thing to do was to bury it since it was a skeleton after all. He said it's probably from the 1800s. Of course, most would ask, why is your dad's medical anatomy skeleton buried in my yard? Tell him to come get it. But she was satisfied with his answer. I came across a clip a news station had of Herb Baumeister. It must have been a slow news day because the interview takes place outside. The reporter is standing there talking to him about the state employees painting lines on the road. Herb says that they painted the line right over a dead raccoon. Herb was appalled that they didn't get out and move the dead raccoon. They just ran the stripe right over it. Herb says, quote, "The poor thing deserved a better fate and they should have kicked it out of the way before painting." Herb said that he was with his son and didn't know what to do with it, so he just grabbed his Polaroid camera and snapped a photo of it. Knowing what we know now, the whole thing is eerie because instead of feeling sorry for the raccoon, he was fascinated by it. He's fixated on it. He likely photographed it because it was dead and desecrated by paint. Police at first weren't crazy about the idea that Herb Baumeister could be a serial killer. How could this upstanding citizen who donates $50,000 a year to a children's charity be responsible for dozens of men who have gone missing? They don't believe he's capable of pulling something like this off. How is he going to go to gay bars when he has a wife and children at home? In November 1995, detectives don't have enough evidence to get a search warrant, so they want to just try asking him if he can consent to a search of his property. They arrive at Fox Hollow Farms, and Herb answers the door. He tells them, "No, go away." So their next option is to try Julie, since she is the co-owner of the home. Maybe she'll give them permission. They find her at Save-A-Lot working. The 90s were a weird time. So they tell her, "We believe your husband is responsible for, quote, homosexual homicide." She's like, "What?" They say they believe he is going to bars, taking men home, and killing them. She says, no, that's not true. She is angry and refuses to allow them to search her property. 5 months later, they approach her again, but she refuses to allow them to search her property. The couple was on the brink of divorce and not speaking to one another, but she still wasn't going to turn on him. She couldn't accept that this could be true. Julie has heard of all of these missing men and think there's no way possible that her husband is involved. 6 months later, in June 1996, Julie was tired of Herb's mood swings. She's filed for divorce, and Herb is away on vacation. Julie checks the calendar and discovers that all of these men who went missing disappeared on the days that she and the kids were away at the lake house, and this can't be a coincidence. Julie finally consents to a search of her property. She told them about her son finding a human skull 2 years prior. They search the property and find the remains of 11 men. They found bones and body parts covered with leaves on top of the ground in a wooded area 50 to 60 feet behind the house. They go inside and find the indoor pool, the wet bar, the mannequins, everything Tony had described. They also found a secret hidden video camera. If all of these murders were recorded, that would be huge, but unfortunately they couldn't find the videotapes anywhere. Sergeant Eddie Moore told reporter Richard Zintrin for APB News, an Indianapolis detective was working on some missing people, and her investigation kept coming back to Herb Baumeister's name. He said, quote, "It was mostly bones. All the flesh and whatnot was eaten away. There was little in the way of artifacts like watches and clothing." He also said most of these men were known to frequent gay bars and the alternative lifestyle in the Indianapolis area. So we've got 11 sets of human remains found on Herb's farm, but detectives believe there are at least 9 more men that Herb could be linked to. That's 20 men. For perspective, Jeffrey Dahmer had 17. Some of these bones had been pulverized and used as gravel in his driveway. Little pebbles that his kids played with outside were determined to be bone fragments. Police now have enough evidence to issue an arrest warrant. They believe Herb was picking these men up at bars, bringing them back to his house for consensual sex, then he would kill them and bury them on the property. The murders in Ohio, the ones on I-70 where the men were found strangled, that was back when he didn't have all this land to put the bodies on, so they were discarded along Highway I-70. He didn't have 18 acres of land until they moved to Fox Hollow Farms. Once the Baumeisters moved into the new house, the bodies stopped appearing on the highway. Even witness sketches of the I-70 strangler were looked back at, and surprised, they look exactly like Herb Baumeister. Julie provided fuel receipts and other items to police that would confirm he was in the area of I-70 when the men were killed. Finally, the media is talking about those missing men. Camera trucks are rolling into Fox Hollow Farm, and reporters are reporting live from the scene of a serial killer's house. Detective Vandegrift, who was the detective that Tony went to after his attempted murder, said, quote, "He fit all the components of a serial killer. Among them, the ability to keep his crimes in control and silent under an everyday nonchalance. He was a business owner whose store many townspeople frequented. My own office was only 1.5 miles away from this place. I never met him, but from what I understand, he wasn't the type of guy you'd at first suspect of being a sexual psychopath." He also went on to say that Herb had all these danger signals. They are always there, even in people of Herb's caliber, but everyone ignored them. Even his wife ignored them. Being ignored is a serial killer's greatest strength. Meanwhile, Julie is freaking out. Not only is she now aware her husband is a serial killer, but her son Eric is currently away on vacation with him. She doesn't want Herb to find out that these remains have all been located because he may go on the run. Eric is with him, so they have custody papers drawn up. The reports say that Eric was taken by authorities away from Herb. I'm not sure why he wasn't arrested right then and there, but they make it seem like this was a custody thing done by Julie due to the divorce, when in reality, she just wants her son away from him in case he finds out and does something stupid. Herb was annoyed but peaceful and let his son go with authorities without any incident. Meanwhile, the yard is still being evacuated. This is Indiana's largest serial killer. The police have never dealt with something at this level. Herb is taken off from vacation after giving his son Eric back. No one knows where he could be. But Herb's younger brother calls police because at the time he was completely unaware of everything going on at Fox Hollow Farm. He gets a phone call from Herb, and he told him he was in Fenville, Michigan on a business trip. He told him he needed some money fast. His brother wired him money. Within hours, he learned of all the human remains found on his brother's property, so he called police. The police tell Brad that if he calls you again, tell him that we need him to call us to discuss some things. The next night, Herb did call Brad and asked for more money. Herb has made his way into Canada at this point. Ontario police told the Indianapolis Star they believe Herb arrived in Sarnia on June 30th, spending several days there before driving east along the Lake Huron shoreline to Grand Bend, Ontario. He was stopped by a Canadian police officer who asked him why he was sleeping in his car under a bridge. The officer looks in the car with a flashlight and sees luggage in the back seat along with a bunch of VCR tapes. Herb tells her he's just a tourist passing through and he didn't want to shell out money for a hotel, so she lets him go. The next day, this is July 3rd, 1996, Herb pulls into Pinery Park in Ontario, Canada. He took one last life, which was his own. He pulled out a .357 and shot himself in the forehead. He left a 3-page suicide note. Basically, it's just him rambling on and on. He says his reason for committing suicide is that his business is failing and his marriage is over. He says he's going to eat his favorite snack, a peanut butter sandwich, and then he's going to go to sleep. He doesn't make a single mention of any of the men he killed. He says he circled the park a few times before stopping. He had another area that he intended to take his life at, but he saw children playing nearby, so he left. He apologized for messing up the park with his suicide. There was no sign of the videotapes that were in his car the day before, so he likely threw them in the lake before shooting himself. This leads us to believe they were the recordings of each murder. Most serial killers keep trophies from each victim. The videotapes were likely his trophies. It's unfair that Herb gave himself the dignity of death that he withheld from all of his victims. Herb would be located in a public park in a shaded parking spot with a goodbye letter. None of his victims got that. According to writer Sarah Murrell, she summed it up well by saying, quote, "The hands that lovingly prepared the children's peanut butter and jelly before school squeezed the life out of other people's children. The same guy that invited his neighbors over to decorate the Christmas tree left dead bodies in the woods where his kids played. The guy who got U2 tickets killed a football team, and then he killed himself." One thing that always comes up in this case is that Fox Hollow Farms is now owned by a man named Rob Graves. He bought the property around 20 years ago and said the plan was to have the house bulldozed within 24 hours. Rob and many others claim the property is overrun with ghosts. People say the door knocker will start banging really hard at night, so much that the door becomes hot. People see ghostly apparitions there all the time. Most look like men in their 20s just out walking around on the property. Paranormal researchers love this property. You can go on YouTube and see some really good footage of them checking it out. The TV show Ghost Hunters did a whole episode of this property. One of Rob's friends stayed over and said he saw a full-body apparition, which appeared to be a young man running super fast. Others say they see a man, but only from the waist up, but he moves along just fine. The remains of the men were given back to their families. Some bodies went unclaimed, which is so sad. In 1999, detectives pleaded with the public to come forward if you have a missing relative that fits the description of these men. They had DNA samples from each of them, and they could check to see if it's a match. The most recent piece of news I could find about Herb Baumeister was from 2024, and I was shocked to see that. An Indiana group for unidentified deceased victims, along with the coroner's office, had a beautiful plaque erected to honor the victims. This was the first time the community formally remembered the victims in a public dedication. I watched an interview with one of the victims' mothers. His name was Alan Livingston. He was 27 and disappeared in 1993. She wondered for years where he could be. After submitting her DNA, it was matched with one of the sets of remains. Julie says life for her and her children was very hard afterwards. The kids had only known their dad as this loving guy who made their lunches for them and spent quality time with them. That's all they knew of him. So when it comes out he had killed dozens of men, they didn't know what to feel. Julie and the kids moved out of the house and back into their previous home before that they had bought Fox Hollow Farms. Julie says her biggest question is how could he have loved us and was able to do something like this? Julie was interviewed by Oprah Winfrey many years ago and told her she had no knowledge whatsoever that her husband was doing these things. Only 9 of Herb Baumeister's victims have been identified. In total, 10,000 pieces of human remains were found on his property. Shout out to Tony, who alerted the private detective. He put himself at risk that night in the pool just to try to get to the bottom of where his friend Roger was. Rest in peace to every victim of this man. He will never receive the earthly justice he deserved. There are dozens of victims, and they are not forgotten. The ones that we have confirmation of are Roger Goodlett, age 33, Michael Kieran, age 50, Stephen Hale, age 28, Manuel Resendez, age 31, Jeffrey Jones, age 37, Richard Hamilton Jr., age 23, Johnny Bayer, age 26, Alan Broussard, age 32, and Alan Livingston, age 27. That's it for this week, and I'll see you all again soon. Take care, and much love to you all.